Well, so civilizations are rising and starting. You have the rise of cities and empires, and some of those empires start to become very, well, imperialistic. That's what makes an empire, and invading the territories of other. And so you start to see this with some of the Mesopotamian groups, some of the Mesoamerican groups, certainly within the Harappan and later Indian civilizations, Chinese civilizations, Japanese civilizations. But you start to see groups that are aggressively territorially expanding and absorbing other groups or pushing other groups to the margins. And eventually you see that in such extreme forms as Greek and Roman empires, where you're controlling just huge swaths, Mongolian, controlling huge swaths of land at any given time. So this, so certainly we see, as a result, groups such as hunter-gatherer groups start to be pushed to more marginal territories and start to have less of their land base. However, civilizations, just because they rise, doesn't mean they stick around. And indeed, as your book kind of poignantly points out, civilizations always eventually collapse. And I kind of want to clarify what we mean by that. To say that civilizations historically have always collapsed is not to say that the people die out. So to talk, for example, about Mayan civilization, when we say about classic Mayan civilization, and then when we say terminal and the Mayan collapse, we don't mean that Mayan people died out. They certainly didn't. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of Mayan people alive today, and indeed there are Mayan villages all across Central America. Go to Guatemala, spend some time in the highlands of Guatemala, you'll come across tons and tons and tons of Mayan villages. It's not that Mayan culture collapsed so much as it is that the civilization system, where you had these huge cities with huge monumental architecture such as the pyramids, and these religious elites that were or these political elites that were kind of controlling that whole system, that sort of fell apart, and then people decentralized. They moved out to smaller villages, and things looked very different by the time the Spanish had arrived. And it's the same when we talk about any of these civilizations. By and large, entire groups of people don't become entirely extinguished typically. So it does happen, and it has happened, but what is much more common is that the society dissolves to some degree or decentralizes, but to some degree the people and the culture keep going. So just so you know what I mean when I say the collapse of civilizations, and when your book says that societies always collapse. But it is true, and it's an interesting historical finding, that by and large, societies, especially the earliest civilizations, that civilizations, and especially the earliest civilizations, eventually collapsed, right? There's no Ur-3 dynasty anymore. There's no Harappan dynasty anymore. The Qing dynasty is long gone. And so these early civilizations died out and collapsed. And they collapsed for lots of different reasons. Warfare, disease, all sorts of things. Empires overstretching themselves in some cases, like some of the collapses that we associate with Greek and Roman Empire. Oftentimes collapses have a great deal to do with environmental factors, at least as far as we can tell. This is always sort of speculative because we're having to go off the archaeology and do our best possible interpretation of what was going on. But a lot of these, there seems to have been environmental factors, and you can see this, for example, with the Rapa Nui group in Easter Island. So in the island that we now call Easter Island, with the indigenous group, the Rapa Nui, you have these huge stone moai, like large head / kind of busts of people that are found all around the island. And when European explorers came to the area, they were very confused by the presence of these, as well as by the fact that the landscape, as you can kind of see here, didn't support very large vegetation at all, nothing bigger than a bush really. And the people generally didn't seem to be have very large cities or like a huge amount of like surplus of vegetation. It was kind of confusing why you had these huge stone heads and where these came from, and why the people at that time seemed like they were kind of shall I say, just barely sort of making enough food and everything to get by, and yet you have clearly this evidence of a very different kind of society going on. As we've done more archaeology and environmental science in the area, the dominant theory, I would say, and there's been some pushback, including among some Rapa Nui scholars about this, but the dominant theory seems to be that what had happened was that there used to be a much larger population of Rapa Nui people on the island, and it was one where there was a clear hierarchy and monumental architecture, aka civilization. And the there was a kind of system where you had these religious/political elites, people whose claim to status was based on their lineage, which sort of had both a religious and political connotation to it. And these moais were symbols of their different chiefly lineages. But how do you move, well, first of all, how do you make the giant things, but then also how do you move them around at the island? And trying to experiment with this and try to figure it out, the determination has been that there used to actually be large trees on the island, and we can tell that from if you dig down far enough in the soil, and that these trees were cut down and used as a rope and pulley system. So the bark was stripped for pulleys, and the logs themselves were used as kind of like wheels to move these stone entities from the quarries to the different parts of the island. So really ingenious. The problem being that it involves cutting down trees. As this was happening, you also had the introduction by the Polynesian explorers that were on Rapa Nui of rats. This still happens nowadays. Non-native species get spread around as people discover and colonize new lands. And so in this case, rats came with the early Polynesian colonizers of the island. And so as a result, you had rats that were eating the seeds of the trees. So the combination of rats not allowing new trees to be made because they're eating all the seeds, plus using all the trees to move these stone heads around, eventually led to a situation where essentially the entire forest ecosystem collapsed, and you no longer have a forest ecosystem there. And as a result, as far as we can tell, the population dramatically declined very quickly, and the sort of religious political hierarchy collapsed. So it was an environmental thing. It was an overuse of resource in part for ideological and political reasons, a cautionary tale for ourselves. The Mayan collapse, somewhat similar. There's different theories, including infectious diseases that may have happened, as well as invasion from other groups, as well as an overextension of the trade network. One of the theories that I find most compelling, and it's probably because I was originally trained as an environmental scientist, so I sort of have a bias for theories that involve the environment, but this is probably one of the more prevalent theories, is the idea that the Mayan sort of huge city system and huge elite priestly system collapsed because of environmental factors, and more specifically that after 900 AD, people departed and kind of dispersed out to these small villages, and there was a bit of a population crash because probably what was happening is that the farming system that was supporting thousands of people in these huge cities collapsed. And there's different theories for what might have happened, one of which is that there was a mega drought, and as a result people had to farm more intensively, and what had been a sustainable system of slash and burn suddenly became unsustainable as people started using the same pieces of land more often and not giving them as much time to regrow. And eventually this leads to things like poor soil nutrients, declining agriculture, mudslides, and eventually it's just dangerous and not enough productivity to maintain these cities, and people decentralize into smaller villages, which are a lot more adaptive because you don't have to support thousands, you can instead support a couple hundred. Or there may have been other kinds of environmental variables, maybe just overproduction for the elites, right, for the political elites. Either way, it seems like one of the dominant theories is that the soils were overused, the system collapsed, there could no longer be this sort of system where, a few people were farming for everybody, and people ended up going out to the villages instead. Kind of the same deal if we talk about over in Mesopotamia, one of the earliest civilizations ever in Mesopotamia/modern Iraq, the third Dynasty, or 3 Dynasty as you sometimes might hear it be called. 2030 to 1980 BC, you have the city of is the largest city in the world. It has about 0.1% of the population, about 65,000 people. Now, 65,000 people doesn't maybe sound that large, but again, at the time, it's about 0.1% of the population, which compares pretty favorably to the largest city in the world today, which is in China, and which contains about 0.5% of the world's population. So to say that a city contains 0.1% of the human population, that's bonkers, right? That's a lot of people. So 65,000 people. and a very advanced, complex civilization with a cuneiform writing system, but it collapsed apparently, as far as we can tell, from over-salinization of soils. So when you irrigate lands, depending on what kind of water you use, this can cause sometimes salt to accumulate on the soil surface, and if that happens, especially in desert climates, and if that happens over and over and over again, eventually you get like a caked layer of salt on the surface, which is very, very not good for plants. So we see, as we look at the old soil, that basically it started, you were using wheat, and then they had to transition to barley, which can deal with salt better, but isn't kind of as useful of a crop. And then eventually it just seems like the city/state empire collapsed.